1715. For 72 years, one man has been the center of the universe. Louis XIV, the Sun King, the architect of absolute monarchy, lies dying in his bed at Versailles. To the outside world, France is the pinnacle of civilization. Its language is the tongue of diplomacy. Its fashions are mimicked from London to St. Petersburg. Its army is the most feared in Europe. But behind the gilded mirrors and the marble statues lies a rot that no amount of incense can mask. Louis XIV's reign was one of perpetual motion. He built Versailles at a cost that modern economists struggle to calculate, billions in today's currency. He fought 4 major wars: the Franco-Dutch War, the War of the Reunions, the 9 Years' War, and the grueling War of the Spanish Succession. These were not just battles, they were existential drains on the nation's marrow. By the time the Sun King breathes his last, on September 1st, 1715, the treasury is not just empty, it is a cavern of bottomless debt. Consider the math. The state owed 3 billion livres. To put that in perspective, the total tax revenue for the year was roughly 145 million. After paying the interest on the debt and the basic costs of the government, there was nothing left. France was effectively a bankrupt corporation with a military it couldn't pay and a population it couldn't feed. The successor is a child, Louis XV, only 5 years old. The task of governing falls to the regent, Philippe, Duke of Orleans. Philippe is a man of high intellect but low morals, a libertine who enjoys the company of atheists and artists. He inherits a kingdom where the currency is being debased, where tax collectors are being lynched, and where the nobility refuses to be taxed. The Duke of Orleans knows that traditional methods, taxing the poor more or clipping the edges of gold coins, will no longer work. France doesn't need a new treasurer, it needs a revolution in how the world understands value itself. It needs a man who sees the future. While France was drowning in debt, a Scotsman named John Law was running for his life. In April 1694, in Bloomsbury Square, London, Law killed a man named Beau Wilson in a duel. The cause? A dispute over a woman, though some whispered it was over a gambling debt. Law was captured, tried, and sentenced to death. But John Law was not a man meant for the gallows. Using his connections and a considerable amount of silver, he managed to bribe his way out of prison and escaped to the European continent. For the next 20 years, John Law lived the life of a high-rolling fugitive. But he wasn't just gambling at the card tables of Venice. He was studying the world's most advanced financial systems. In Amsterdam, he saw the Dutch East India Company and the Bank of Amsterdam. He realized that the Dutch were not powerful because they had the most gold, but because they had the most credit. They understood that money was not a thing, but an idea. At the time, the world was obsessed with specie, gold and silver. If you didn't have the physical metal, you weren't wealthy. Law realized this was a delusion. Gold is heavy, gold is scarce, gold is a bottleneck. He wrote a revolutionary treatise, Money and Trade Considered, with a proposal for supplying the nation with money. His argument was simple yet radical. A nation's wealth is not measured by the gold in its vaults, but by its trade and industry. To stimulate trade, you need a circulating medium that isn't tied to the slow mining of precious metals. You need paper money. Law was a man of immense charisma and a mathematical genius. He could calculate the odds of a card game faster than any man in Europe. He began to see the entire economy of a nation as one giant game of probability. In 1714, he returned to Paris. He had tried to pitch his ideas to Louis XIV years earlier, but the old king had rejected him because Law was not a Catholic. But the Sun King was gone. The regent, the Duke of Orleans, was an old gambling friend of Law's. In the lavish, wine-soaked salons of the Palais Royal, Law began to whisper into the regent's ear. "I can pay your debts," Law promised. "I can make France the richest nation in history. I can turn paper into gold. To a desperate Duke of Orleans, this Scottish murderer didn't sound like a criminal, he sounded like a savior. To reach our 15,000-word goal, we will dive deep into the technical mechanics, the social atmosphere of Paris, and the specific decrees that built this house of cards. Here are chapters 3, 4, and 5. In May 1716, the theory met reality. Law was granted a royal patent to open the Banque Générale. In the beginning, it was a private institution, funded by Law and a few brave investors, but it had a unique state-sanctioned superpower. Its paper notes were officially recognized as legal tender for the payment of taxes. This was the hook. To the 18th-century Frenchman, paper was suspect, but if the king's tax collectors accepted it, it suddenly carried the weight of the crown. Law's bank addressed a physical crisis. The French coinage system was a mess. The government frequently recoined the currency, literally calling in all gold coins, melting them down, and reissuing them at the same value. It was state-sponsored theft. Law offered stability. He promised that his banknotes would always be redeemable for the specific weight of silver mentioned on the note at the time of issue. For the first time in years, the French people had a currency they could trust. Economists call this the velocity of money. When people trust their currency, they spend it. When they spend it, businesses grow. Within months, the stagnant French economy began to twitch with life. Ships began to sail. Textiles began to sell. Law was no longer seen as a Scottish adventurer. He was being hailed as the Socrates of the West. But for Law, the bank was merely the foundation. To truly solve the debt of the French Empire, he needed something much larger than a bank. He needed a dream so vast that it would capture the imagination of every man, woman, and child in Europe. He turned his eyes toward the sunset, toward the new world. In August 1717, Law incorporated the Compagnie d'Occident, the Company of the West. He was granted a 25-year monopoly on all trade between France and the Louisiana Territory. At the time, Louisiana was not the state we know today. It was a sprawling, uncharted wilderness stretching from the mouth of the Mississippi River all the way to the Canadian border. To the French public, it was a blank canvas, and John Law was a master of the brush. Law launched what can only be described as the first modern propaganda campaign. He flooded Paris with pamphlets. They described Louisiana as a land where the rivers ran over beds of gold dust, where the soil was so fertile it produced 2 crops a year without effort, and where the climate was a perpetual spring. One pamphlet even claimed that the indigenous people of the Mississippi were so wealthy they used emeralds as fishing weights and would gladly trade a pound of gold for a French iron knife. It was a complete fabrication. In reality, Louisiana was a swampy, mosquito-infested graveyard where the first French settlers were dying of yellow fever and starvation. But Paris didn't know that. They didn't want to know that. They wanted to believe in a shortcut to riches. Law began issuing shares in the company. To buy a share, you had to pay in billets d'État, the old, nearly worthless government bonds. This was Law's stroke of genius. He told the public, that worthless piece of paper the government gave you to pay for the last war? Give it to me. I will give you a share in the gold mines of Louisiana. The government's debt was being sucked out of the economy and converted into equity in a private company. On paper, the national debt was vanishing. In reality, it was being transformed into a speculative bubble. Law's ambition was an apex predator. By 1719, he began a process of total integration. He realized that if his system was to work, he had to control every single valve of the French economy. First, he bought the Compagnie du Sénégal. Then he absorbed the Compagnie des Indes Orientales, the East India Company, and the Compagnie de Chine. By May 1719, Law had created a super company, the Compagnie des Indes. This single corporation now held a total monopoly on all French trade outside of Europe. It controlled the tobacco trade, the slave trade, the spice trade, and the fur trade. But Law wasn't finished. He went to the regent with an even bolder proposal. The state is bad at collecting taxes, Law argued. Let my company do it. For a massive fee, the company took over the Femme Générale, the national tax collection system. Now, the Mississippi Company didn't just control trade, it controlled the very revenue of the French government. Finally, Law won the right to mint the nation's coins. At this moment, Law had achieved something no human has done before or since. He was the head of the national bank, the head of the only international trading company, the nation's tax collector, and the master of the mint. He was, quite literally, the economy of France. The stage was set. The bank was printing the money, the company was providing the dream. All that was needed now was the spark of human greed to turn this controlled experiment into an uncontrollable inferno. To continue building toward our 15,000-word goal, we now enter the most chaotic and feverish period of the bubble. These chapters focus on the sociological explosion of wealth and the technical manipulation of the market. By late 1719, Paris had become the center of the financial universe, and the Rue de Canquemois was its beating, bloody heart. This narrow, 15-foot-wide alleyway became the first unofficial stock exchange in history. It didn't matter who you were, the system was a great equalizer. Because the potential for profit was so immense, the rigid social hierarchy of the Bourbon monarchy began to dissolve. A duke would stand shoulder to shoulder with a footman, both of them covered in the same street grime, both of them screaming for actions, the shares of the Mississippi Company. Law understood the psychology of the crowd. To keep the momentum going, he issued shares in waves. First came the mères, the mothers, then the filles, the daughters, and finally the petites filles, the granddaughters. Each new issue was priced higher than the last, creating a fear of missing out that predates modern market manias by centuries. The demand was so physical, so violent, that the residents of the street began to charge rent just for the use of their chairs. A single room overlooking the street could be rented for more than a country estate would earn in a year. One woman reportedly paid a massive sum just to have a small wooden box placed in the street so she could stand above the crowd and shout her orders to the brokers. It was during this madness that a new word entered the French lexicon: millionaire. Before 1719, wealth was measured in land, titles, and lineage. Now, wealth was a number on a piece of paper. Stories of overnight wealth became the folklore of the city. There was the story of a common servant who, sent by his master to sell shares at 8,000 livres, arrived late to find the price had risen to 10,000. He pocketed the difference, bought his own shares, and within a week was wealthier than the aristocratic family he had served for 20 years. This wasn't just growth, it was an explosion. In the span of a few months, the Mississippi shares rose by 2,000%. For John Law, this was the ultimate validation. He was no longer just a Scotsman, he was the grand controller of the most prosperous nation on earth. He converted to Catholicism, a requirement for his official appointment as Controller General of Finance, and was hailed as a genius who had finally solved the scarcity of money. But there was a dark side to this wealth. As the paper price of shares rose, the price of everything else followed. In Paris, the cost of bread, meat, and cloth began to skyrocket. The millionaires didn't care. They had the paper. But for the thousands who hadn't entered the market, the Mississippi Miracle was beginning to feel like a curse. How was this possible? How could a company with no actual profits, no gold from Louisiana, no spices from the East yet, sustain a valuation that exceeded the total amount of physical gold in Europe? The answer lay in Law's circular engine. As the stock price rose, people needed more currency to buy them. Law, as the head of the Banque Royale, simply printed it. Law's bank was no longer just a bank, it was a printing press for the company's success. He issued a decree that the bank would lend money to anyone who wanted to buy Mississippi stock, using the stock itself as collateral. Think about the danger of this. You use paper money to buy stock. You then use that stock as a guarantee to borrow more paper money to buy more stock. This created a feedback loop that defied the laws of economic gravity. The more money Law printed, the higher the stock went. The higher the stock went, the wealthier the people felt, and the more they borrowed. By early 1720, there was more than 1 billion livres in paper currency circulating in France. To back this up, the bank held only a tiny fraction in actual gold and silver. Law was betting everything on Louisiana. He believed that eventually the real-world profits from the colonies would catch up to the paper value he had created. He just needed more time. But time is the one thing a bubble never gives you. The first crack in the system didn't come from a peasant, but from the highest levels of the nobility. The Prince de Conti, a man of immense ego and even larger debts, had been a supporter of Law until Law refused to sell him shares at a discounted price. Conti decided to test the system's foundations. In early 1720, he gathered 3 massive wagons and sent them to the doors of the Banque Royale. He didn't want more shares. He wanted gold. Conti presented his paper notes and demanded their face value in silver and gold coins. Law was horrified. He knew that if the public saw wagons of gold leaving the bank, the illusion of paper as gold would vanish. Law appealed to the regent. The regent ordered Conti to return 2/3 of the gold, but the damage was done. The smart money, the great lords and the international bankers began to realize the bank was a hollow shell. They didn't make a scene like Conti. They did something much more dangerous. They began to quietly, systematically cash out. By February 1720, the leakage of gold became a flood. Law realized that if people kept exchanging paper for gold, the bank would be empty within weeks. His response was a descent into financial totalitarianism. He issued a series of increasingly desperate decrees. First, he limited the amount of gold one could withdraw. Then he did the unthinkable. He banned the possession of more than 500 livres in gold or silver. Law turned France into a police state to save his bank. It became a crime to hold your own wealth in precious metals. He authorized rewards to informants who snitched on neighbors hiding gold. He even authorized exempt search parties to enter homes and rip up floorboards in search of hidden coins. Law's logic was pure but insane. If gold is illegal, paper is the only thing left. If paper is the only thing left, the system cannot fail. But he forgot the first rule of money. Value is not dictated by the state. It is dictated by trust. And the people of France were starting to get very, very scared. To continue our progression toward the 15,000-word mark, we now enter the death spiral. These chapters detail the specific policy errors and the visceral, violent reactions of the Parisian public as the illusion of wealth began to evaporate. By February 1720, John Law was fighting a war on 2 fronts. The stock price was wobbling as people began to sell, and the bank was bleeding gold. In a move of staggering overconfidence, Law decided to fuse his 2 creations into one. The Banque Royale and the Compagnie des Indes became a single entity. This was the ultimate consolidation of power. Law's theory was that by backing the bank with the assets of the company, the supposed gold of Louisiana, and backing the company with the liquidity of the bank, the printing press. By February 1720, John Law was fighting a war on 2 fronts. The stock price was wobbling as people began to sell, and the bank was bleeding gold. In a move of staggering overconfidence, Law decided to fuse his 2 creations into one. The Banque Royale and the Compagnie des Indes became a single entity. This was the ultimate consolidation of power. Law's theory was that by backing the bank with the assets of the company, the supposed gold of Louisiana, and backing the company with the liquidity of the bank, the printing press, he would create an unbreakable circle. but in reality, he had simply tied two sinking ships together. If one failed, the other was guaranteed to drown. To support the stock price, Law made a fatal promise. The bank would buy back shares of the company at a fixed price of 9,000 livres. This was intended to create a floor for the market. Law thought that if people knew they could always sell for 9,000, they would never feel the need to sell. He was wrong. Professional speculators, the vultures of the Rue de Quincampoix, realized that Law had just given them a guaranteed exit. They began dumping their shares on the bank by the thousands. To pay for them, Law had to print more paper money than ever before. By May 1720, the sheer volume of paper money in France was astronomical. There were roughly 2.6 billion livres in circulation, while the actual value of the company's trade was almost non-existent. Inflation was no longer a threat, it was a reality. A loaf of bread that cost 1 sou in 1716 now cost 20. Law realized the currency was doomed. He had to deflate the bubble before it exploded. On May 21, 1720, he issued the most infamous decree in financial history. The edict stated that the value of Mississippi shares would be gradually reduced from 9,000 livres to 5,000. Simultaneously, the value of the bank's paper notes would be cut by 50%. It was a mathematical necessity, but a psychological disaster. With a single stroke of a pen, Law had told the people of France that the money in their pockets was worth half of what it was yesterday. The trust that Law had spent 4 years building vanished in 4 hours. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The morning after the edict, thousands of Parisians descended on the Rue de Vivienne, where the bank was headquartered. They didn't come to trade, they came to demand whatever silver was left before it was all gone. The doors of the bank remained shut. The French guards were called out to maintain order, but even they were sympathetic to the crowd. Many of them had invested their own meager pay in Law's system. The heat of the Parisian summer added to the misery. On several occasions, the crush became so intense that people were literally squeezed to death standing up. In one horrific morning in July, 16 people were found trampled or suffocated outside the bank's doors. The mob's anger found a target, John Law. He was no longer the Socrates of the West. He was a charlatan, a foreign sorcerer, and a Scottish thief. His carriage was attacked, his windows were smashed, and his family was forced to hide under the protection of the regent's private guard. In a desperate attempt to distract the public and pump up the value of the Mississippi Company one last time, Law resorted to a bizarre and cruel piece of theater. He ordered the police to round up the beggars, the homeless, and the criminals from the streets of Paris. He gave them new clothes and shovels and marched them through the city, claiming they were pioneers headed to Louisiana to dig up the mountains of gold he had promised. As soon as these pioneers reached the ports of La Rochelle or Lorient, most of them sold their shovels for a bottle of wine and disappeared. When the few survivors reached the paradise of Louisiana, they found only mosquitoes, humidity, and hostile terrain. Back in Paris, the ruse worked for only a few days. When the public realized the gold miners were just the same beggars they saw every day, the last shred of Law's credibility evaporated.
By the end of 1720, the regent realized that the system could not be saved. Law was dismissed from his post and, fearing for his life, fled France in December, carrying only a small amount of gold and a few diamond rings. The task of cleaning up the wreckage fell to the Paris brothers, 4 financiers who had been Law's bitter rivals. They established a process known as the visa. Every person in France who held a Mississippi share or a banknote was required to bring it to the government to be verified. It was a brutal audit. Over 500,000 people submitted their claims. The commission looked at how you acquired the paper. If you were a speculator who had made a fortune on the Rue de Quincampoix, your notes were canceled or heavily taxed. If you were a victim who had been forced to take paper for your land, you might get a small fraction of your value back in government bonds. The system ended not with a bang, but with a bonfire. Millions of livres in paper were burned in the courtyard of the city hall. The millionaires were broken. The wealth of the nation had been reshuffled, leaving the middle class devastated and the nobility deeper in debt than ever. To reach the 15,000-word milestone, we will now expand into the most harrowing consequences of the bubble. We will look at the biological disaster that followed the financial one, the liquidation of the French soul, and the tragic endgame of John Law. As if the financial collapse were not enough, a more ancient and terrifying horseman was riding toward France. In May 1720, precisely as John Law was issuing his disastrous devaluation edict, a merchant ship named the Grand Saint-Antoine arrived at the port of Marseille. The ship had come from the Levant, and it was carrying a cargo of fine silks and cottons intended for the great fair of Beaucaire. It was also carrying the bubonic plague. Under normal circumstances, the city's quarantine would have been absolute, but these were not normal circumstances. Some of the ship's owners were powerful men in the Mississippi Company. They were desperate for the profits from the cargo to offset their plummeting stock values. They used their influence to bypass the quarantine. Within weeks, the Great Plague of Marseille was ravaging the south of France. As the paper wealth of Paris was dying, the people of the South were dying in the streets by the tens of thousands. To the French public, the two events were spiritually linked. The moral rot of John Law's gambling system had, in their eyes, brought down the literal rot of the Black Death as a form of divine punishment. Back in Paris, the Visa Commission was finishing its work. The process of re-establishing the economy was a form of cold mathematical surgery. The Paris brothers who oversaw the liquidation were not interested in fairness, they were interested in survival. They created a hierarchy of suffering. If you were a servant who had saved a few notes, you were given a small pension. But if you were a member of the bourgeoisie who had sold your family's ancestral land to buy Mississippi shares, you were told that your loss was the price of your greed. This led to a permanent shift in French society. The middle class, the shopkeepers, the lawyers, the small-scale landowners had been the backbone of the state. Law's system had effectively wiped them out. They didn't just lose their money, they lost their faith in the monarchy. The Duke of St. Simon, a famous diarist of the time, wrote that the system had turned the world upside down, making the wise into fools and the honest into thieves. The social contract of France was beginning to fray at the edges, 70 years before the first brick was pulled from the Bastille. And what of the architect? Law spent his final years as a ghost. He traveled from Brussels to London and finally to Venice. He lived in a modest apartment, a far cry from the Palace Royal. He spent his days in the gambling houses of the city, not as a high roller, but as a man playing for his dinner. He never stopped writing. He sent letter after letter to the French court, pleading for a chance to return, insisting that his system hadn't failed, it had simply been interrupted. He blamed the Prince de Conti, he blamed the Paris brothers, he blamed the panic of the people. He died in Venice in 1929, nearly forgotten. He was buried in the church of San Gemignano. When the church was later demolished, his remains were moved to San Moise, where a simple plaque marks the final resting place of the man who almost owned France. He died a poor man, yet he had created more wealth than any human being in history. The Mississippi bubble left a scar on the French psyche that would take a century to heal. While England moved forward with the Bank of England and a robust paper credit system which allowed them to fund the Industrial Revolution, France retreated into the past. The word bank became a dirty word in the French language. For the next 100 years, the French people hoarded gold under their floorboards and in their mattresses. They refused to trust paper money. This hard money obsession crippled French industry. Because there was no easy credit, French inventors and entrepreneurs couldn't get the loans they needed to build factories. Law's ghost ensured that while England became the workshop of the world, France remained a largely agrarian society, trapped in its suspicion of the invisible money that Law had championed. Finally, we must look at the direct line from 1720 to 1789. By destroying the Crown's ability to use modern finance, Law inadvertently set the stage for the French Revolution. Because the French state could no longer borrow money easily at low interest rates, it was forced to rely on increasingly desperate and complex tax schemes. These taxes fell almost exclusively on the poor and the burgeoning middle class. When the debt crisis returned under Louis XVI, the king had no John Law to turn to. He had no paper money magic left to perform. He was forced to call the Estates General to ask for more taxes. That meeting was the spark that ignited the revolution. The Mississippi bubble was more than a financial disaster. It was a warning, a demonstration of what happens when the gap between the real economy and the symbolic economy becomes a chasm. John Law showed the world the future, but he showed it to a world that wasn't ready for the consequences. We live in John Law's world now. We use his paper, we use his credit, we trade his actions. The only question is, have we learned to spot the bubble before it bursts?